Good morning, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, first off, a disclaimer. I played this on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System Classic Edition, so yeah, a lot of people could say I kinda cheated, because I'm not ashamed to admit that I used the save anywhere you want and rewind features quite a lot, because Donkey Kong Country games are tough, and I couldn't handle constantly replaying levels I'd already beaten. No thanks. People in the Genesis era could handle it. I couldn't. I need my save features. Apart from that, though, I want to also make a disclaimer that I never played Donkey Kong Country in its original version. I think I played the Game Boy Color remake, but I never played the Super Nintendo version, neither on an emulation nor as a remake. So this does not have any significant childhood memories for me, no nostalgia blinding me. Although that's not to say I don't have any history with Donkey Kong. My first Donkey Kong game that I played was Donkey Kong 64, shortly after that the original Donkey Kong, and I really loved Donkey Kong Country Returns, even bought the 3DS port because I wanted it on the go, and I loved Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze on the Wii U. So I went into this with the expectation that it would handle similarly to those masterpieces. Well, maybe besides Donkey Kong 64. That was more like a Banjo-Kazooie clone. Well, okay. The best thing I can say about Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo is its graphics, while they definitely show their age in comparison to the newer Donkey Kong games, were certainly mind-blowing by Super Nintendo standards, especially with the giant collection that I have on my Classic Edition. It's really amazing to have such large sprites that have so many fluent animations. The backgrounds are nothing special, but the foregrounds have a certain level of detail and realism that you don't really see in too many Super Nintendo games. The game has a lot of atmosphere, and I really like the sound effects used. It adds a layer of personality to the game that a lot of Super Nintendo games were missing, even the monkeyish grunts that Donkey and Diddy do. However, because I'm not used to that old school difficulty, I ended up being a lot more frustrated with the game than I probably should have. There were times when the zoomed in camera was the biggest problem, and because I could barely see obstacles before they came to me, it was really hard to get my reaction times right, and it seemed like the controls were not nearly as precise as they were in the later games. Now, I know it's unfair of me to be comparing this when this was a 1994 game and Returns came out in 2010, but you have to remember that the Super Nintendo Classic Edition came out in 2017, so I'm going to be reviewing it by modern standards if you're going to pick up a modern-made custom Nintendo console. This is definitely the kind of game where you have to have precision platforming, and you also have to know how to use the difference between Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. Donkey Kong has a really terrible roll, but he holds barrels above his head as an upward defense, and he can kill most enemies by just jumping on them in one hit. Diddy is more agile, has a much better roll, and carries barrels in front of him like a frontward shield, but at the cost of he can be thrown backwards by strong enemies if he jumps on them, sometimes to his doom in a pit, in which this game seems to have a lot of them. You will die over and over again, sometimes by no fault of your own, just because the controls don't seem to want to work, or you want to execute a rolling jump, but you just can't for some bizarre reason. There is a save system, thankfully, but it's limited. You can only save at certain points on the world map, but if you have it on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition or the 3DS and Wii U Virtual Consoles, you can easily create restore points anytime you want, making that feature basically useless. Funky Kong also makes his debut in this game, along with several other Donkey Kong characters. He lets you replay any world you want, which is definitely weird for me because I'm used to just being able to select worlds on a map, especially coming off of Super Mario World, which was also on the Super Nintendo that had an interconnected map. It was a little bit jarring for me. I also found that a lot of the additional content that wasn't required to beat the base game was kind of ridiculous, and I didn't feel an incentive to search that far, if at all, for any of them. The Kong letters, the animal icons, and the bonus rooms just felt like filler, and it didn't have the promise of the super amazing bonus level like Returns did. Also, the game was already challenging enough, so I figured, well, if these controls are going to be retro style, then I don't have the patience to put up with this. Apparently there is a 2-player mode, but it's not 2-player direct, controlling at the same time like the Return series did. Instead, you sort of take turns. I never got a chance to try it because I don't know anyone else that wants to play this game with me. But I assume that fans of Super Mario Brothers will get a kick out of this. The Animal Buddies, I've heard a lot of people praise them, and honestly, I ended up doing worse on the levels when I used them than when I just stuck to Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. Maybe it's because I'm used to the way Rambi handles in the newer games. I don't know what it is. It just seemed like they messed up my controls too much when I was already having a hard time adjusting. Now, one thing I absolutely cannot complain about in Donkey Kong Country is the soundtrack. David Wise, Evelyn Fisher, I forgot the name of the third person. I think it was Robin something. They did a great job composing the score, and again, this is kind of a consistent pattern here. By Super Nintendo standards, this was rich. Like, it almost felt like the composers toyed with real instruments for some of these songs. You can hear, pan flutes and a lot of... It's the kind of music that on a system that mostly has a bunch of fake, like, kazoo-sounding MIDI songs, you get full-on atmospheric jungle themes or give you goosebumps, it's so atmospheric, underwater theme. This game is absolutely a joy to listen to. While it may not have the orchestral majesty of more modern games, it's definitely one of the best examples of how the Super Nintendo can push its limits. Now, let me get on to the boss battles before I conclude this review. Most of the boss battles are really simple. A lot of them just jump on the enemy enough and they're dead. The final boss battle was admittedly a lot harder than it should have been, only because Donkey Kong's role is so pathetic, and the game also fakes you out. I know I normally don't like spoiling things, but I feel like in a game this punishing, where if you think that the battle's done and then it resets on you, and you end up dying as a result, then you have to go all the way back if you didn't use the restore point feature, that's just unforgiving. Nevertheless, the final battle has the happiest boss tune I've ever heard, and Smash Bros. Even made a remake of it, which sounds even happier. But other than that, it's decently challenging, but made more challenging than it should be unless you play as Diddy Kong. Overall, Donkey Kong Country is an okay game. I was expecting to hate it a lot more than I did, but maybe the main reason why I didn't like it as much as most people is just because I never grew up in the Super Nintendo era, or because I'm used to more polished platformers, and maybe I'm also just spoiled by Super Mario World, which came out 3 years earlier on the same system and was better in nearly every way except the graphics and music. Overall, I would say Donkey Kong Country is a worthy addition to the SNES Classic lineup, but seeing as those things are stupid rare, you might be wondering, well, Paul, what if I don't have a Classic Edition? Well, I would say definitely get it on the 3DS or Wii U Virtual Console because of the save points, but good luck enjoying them without it, as the checkpoints are very few, the levels tend to drag on for a lot longer than you'd expect, and you don't have any of the helper items that you might have grown accustomed to. This is the kind of game that wants you to have a challenge and treats itself like it's an arcade game. But it has some of the best music, graphics, and ambiance that you'll find in a Super Nintendo game. So as a historical oddity, Donkey Kong Country is well worth checking out. Especially if you can get it on sale, in which case I'd say go for it, if you're a Donkey Kong Country fan, and especially if you're a platforming fan. With that, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this review. I'll try to get to more Super Nintendo reviews if I can actually beat those darn things. The difficulty spike is absolutely ridiculous on Super Nintendo games. And with that said, keep up the suggestions, and until then, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye.